Hello, and welcome back to If These Old Beasts Could Talk. Now, I'm not quite sure what exactly got me into collecting milk bottles. I think it had something to do with researching the local area and just finding out that we had dairies and that we were known for our milk and dairy production in general. But I have amassed quite a collection of milk bottles and quite a bit of knowledge on their uses, their types, and most importantly, how to date and tell how old they are for people who otherwise wouldn't really know. So today I'm going to go over a little bit of that for you, and I'd like to think that this first bottle I'm showcasing here is one of my favorites and one of the most important ones to me. The bottle right here, the same one you saw on the screen a second ago, except I zoomed in now, is a Dunn Brothers Dairy quart bottle from my hometown of Howell, Michigan. Now, what's cool about the Dunn Brothers Dairy is that this is actually where the high school, one of the elementary schools in the old 65 high school, is actually located. It was all the former Dunn Brothers Dairy site. So it's kind of cool that I have this, knowing that I walked on the site where the cows were grazing and really where the dairy was produced. Anyway, without further ado, I'll just show you why this bottle is important in regards to the history. This bottle design right here is what's known as a slug plate bottle. That slug plate is, of course, referencing that area down there where it says Dunn Brothers Dairy, Howell, Michigan, and how it's effectively stamped into the glass while it's still hot. Now, bottles like this represent the older bottles that you can find. This one isn't that early. It's probably from the 1930s. But these are the oldest. And oftentimes, because you're already doing hot work with the glass down there with Dunn Brothers Dairy, you also have nice little patterns around the top. Like you can see that one right there is an accordion pattern up top. Now, these come in all different shapes and sizes. I'm going to go get a few right now because I have a lot of bottles from the local area. So without further ado, let me go grab those. Here. So on top of my Dunn Brothers bottle, you can see right there, I pulled out my Sunshine bottle. I pulled out, which is another Howell bottle, my Martha Farm bottle, which is definitely an older bottle. It's from 1928. And I also pulled out my Hickory Ridge bottle that I just bought. So just to show you, these come in all different shapes and sizes, and there's actually smaller bottles than that half pint down there. There's like quarter pint bottles. But needless to say, these bottles right here, slug plate bottles, are the earliest really milk bottles that you can buy. And they come in all different types, all different brandings. I actually have a Plessland bottle from Brighton I'm going to go get right now. There you go. Now you can see right up there by my Dunn and Sunshine bottle, there's that Plessland bottle from the next town over. And this is my collection right here of just the nicer slug plate bottles. All of them are local. Stockbridge one's a little further away, but I visit Stockbridge all the time, so it's local enough to me. So these are slug plate bottles. Come in all different shapes and sizes. They can have different designs on them. But the thing that makes them slug plate bottles at the end of the day is that they're all glass, and the labels, Martha Farm, Dunn Brothers, Sunshine Milk, Plessland, Hickory Ridge, are all stamped onto the glass hot. So there's no paint to mess up there. Now let's talk about when the paint comes into play. So as you've already seen, I have a little Hickory Ridge half pint bottle. Now, I have a few other Hickory Ridge bottles too. Notably, one of my newer ones, this 1940s quart bottle. A pretty big difference between these bottles, right at the start you can see, is that one has colored paint on it. And as we progressed away from that slug plate design down there, we had some transitional bottles which said half pint liquid and the such, and actually had ink as well. But after a while, notably in the 1940s, we dropped that sort of slug plating altogether, and we just started rolling ink onto the bottles like you see right there. That is a type of ink known as pyroglazing, and pyroglazing just means it's kind of like the ink they use on Pyrex nowadays. It's going to be heat resistant, it's going to be wash resistant, and it's just going to be colorant that is really, really hardy that you can use on bottles, much in the same way as you just stamp the glass on it. Now, this is probably the best example of a pyroglazed bottle I have over here, this Hickory Ridge quart, but I have a few others stored around. They all have ink. Now, the ink fades, the ink gets damaged, and you definitely don't want to wash them with anything abrasive. So, I just recommend that if you have a Pyroglaze bottle, you don't wash it or scratch at it at all. And what I'm going to recommend is that all bottles that you see, like that Hickory Ridge bottle right there, are classified by you as 1940s bottles. Because whereas they're not slug plated like the other bottles that are much older, they're not square yet. They're still round quartz, which you'll come to find out soon is a pretty big indicator of how old they are. You see, until now, all the bottles we've been dealing with, slug plate or pyroglazed, were all round. And that was your traditional milk bottle design. Most people recognize that round milk bottle right there. But with the very late 40s and the early 50s came a new type of bottle, and arguably the bottle that would dominate the market for the next couple of years. The square bottle. Now, the square bottle has a couple of distinct advantages over the round bottle, most notably that it's more space efficient, it's more cubey, and for working in milk trucks, that's a little more ideal for cramming a lot more milk bottles into a lot smaller of an area. And with the ramp up in demand of the early 1950s and the post-war years, I can kind of see why that would be useful. Square bottles like that are late 40s and early 50s, and they actually continued like that all the way up until the late 60s. But this Plessland Farms example over here from Brighton is definitely early 1950s bottle. So bottles like this still use the same paper seals, and that is really where we're about to see the next major change here. We go from them being topped by paper cardboard seals to something a little bit different. Until now, our two bottles have had the same size seals, but this half-pint bottle actually has a little bit of a different plight to it. This half-pint bottle has a reduced size seal top, which is really meant to accommodate two things. It's either meant to accommodate a foil top or a smaller paper seal. And of course, you don't want to be wasting a ton of paper on massive seals, on massive openings for smaller bottles, or just in general. So they transitioned down to a smaller size of opening. Now, this was really the sunset years of the paper seals in the late 50s. And what we transition over to next is going to be a lot more recognizable for people who grew up in the last years of home milk delivery service. To really understand the death of the home milk delivery industry, we have to consider the advancements being made at the time. One of those advancements was shopping centers, not unlike the superstores you go to nowadays, your Kroger's, your Walmart's, your Meijer's. There's a lot of places like that. Now, back in the day, they weren't common, so it really was more economical to order your dairy products from a dairy farm and have it delivered to your house. But now, especially with the rampant car culture of the mid-century, you now have stores that are just a little bit away. So, you don't really need milk delivered anymore. So, this really started the decline of the milk delivery industry. But what started the decline of those paper seals that you see up there on top of that Hickory Ridge round quart was bottle designs like this. This Hickory Ridge square quart. Now, if you look at the top of that square quart right there, it has a lip and what looks like a snap top. Now, that can accommodate two things that I've seen. I've seen people with foil caps on top of those, and I've also seen plastic caps that fit on top of bottles like that. Now, plastics were definitely something new for the mid-century, at least user plastics that weren't really, really dense insulation plastics used in like electronic devices and the such. So disposable plastics really started coming around in the mid-century, and as a result, hey, if we don't have to make paper, which paper can get wet, especially with dairy product, on a bottle, hey, that's just better off for everybody. So they started transitioning over to snap caps over there, like that one. Now, I have a bottle which really just describes the need for a larger volume of milk and the end of the delivery industry, which I have on my shelf over there. and I'm going to go get it for you right now. So I'll be back in a second. Now, as of late, we've been discussing small towns with these relatively large-sized bottles being 1 quart, but let's go even bigger in both categories. Let's go a bigger amount of milk and a bigger city. And for that, I have my Brickley Farms half-gallon. Half-gallon bottles like this were a late mid-century innovation. These things came about in the 60s and were really a response to the fact that, hey, Americans are consuming more and more product. They can store more and more product because of refrigeration and, of course, consumption. So, Brickley bottles like this are some of the biggest milk bottles you can buy. And I decided to get this one just as an example of that. As you can see, it's got a plastic handle on it. That's not necessarily non-disposable plastic. That's kind of like a rubberized handle you can see right there for transporting that bottle. I mean, it's going to get a little bit heavy. So these were really the end of milk bottles. After this, what you see is milk cartons, like you have nowadays, and milk jugs are a little later, but for the most part, it's milk cartons after this. I've seen Hickory Ridge cartons, and this really represents the end of just your general milk delivery bottles. Now, I'm going to go into a few of the specifics as to which bottles were typically used for what, and more or less what you could have ordered from places like this. Now, by no means is milk all that these bottles carried in them. It's all too often that people will just call them milk bottles without really considering the fact that these companies here, be they local dairies or entire large-scale operations, produced a lot more than just milk. Now, one of the main ways we can see this is in something else that goes on these bottles. Because let's be real, a bottle for every single different type of product, that's not really sustainable. But a seal, that can be done. This Ferndale bottle over here, which I've had for a while, actually didn't come with this. It was this Hickory Ridge bottle, and I just got the seal out of it, and the seal was for coffee cream. Now, these businesses produced an awful lot of different products. Obviously, dairy products being dairies, but I've even seen things as crazy as orange and cherry drinks produced by these dairy farms. Now, of course, chocolate milk was a favorite, and I've heard that oftentimes milkmen would surprise children with little half pints of chocolate milk, say on their birthday or something like that, and they oftentimes were carried in these smaller bottles. That is the one thing I can say, is that the smaller bottles got a lot of different uses, a lot more than the big quart bottles did, because the big quart bottles were for the most part for milk. Who needs a quart of coffee creamer? Maybe a coffee shop, but that's really one of the only places that you would expect to need that much of it. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about the various different types of products I've seen in the bottles that would have carried them. So we've already seen that these bottles can deliver a lot more than just milk. And a lot of times, it's in the seal right there that tells you what's in the bottle. Be it some sort of dairy product or some sort of drink, just in general. Now, we get into something a little different. My Plessland Farms square bottle down there actually has a cousin, same paper seal top, just like the Ferndale, except this bottle is a little different than the other bottles we've looked at. This bottle has a big bulb on the top. Whilst it might not be immediately clear why a bulb top bottle like that exists, if you read below Brighton, Michigan on the bottle label, you'll read, "Cream when you want it." Now, that means that this bottle right here, in its general design, was a cream separation bottle. Now, these were useful because you could pour in cream, and then of course, oftentimes with cream, it might separate, and so you could take out the parts that were separating in the little bulb area, and the rest of it would fall down into the body of the quart bottle. That is still a quart bottle, by the way. So, this milk bottle right here would have delivered coffee cream, it would have delivered heavy cream, much like that Ferndale seal says down there for the Ferndale bottle, but this one just had an added layer of usefulness in regards to separation. Now, I've seen bottles like this that weren't manufactured for milk companies that were called like Brookfield baby top bottles that have a little baby face on the separation area. But bulb bottles like this have a general purpose, and that's to allow the liquid that's inside of them to separate. These bottles carried a lot more than milk, and sometimes specialized little containers had to be made to carry things. Now, oftentimes big bottles like that Ferndale bottle and that Plesslim bottle, both on the far left and the far right, are very much normally milk carriers. The smaller bottles that were often in service alongside them were the ones that carried the individual little products that were not milk. But sometimes you needed an even smaller bottle for an even more specialized purpose. And that I'm going to show you now. Now, despite me saying that little half-pint bottles like this one and their even smaller quarter-pint cousins were probably the workhorses of just the general other-than-milk products world, what happens when you need something even smaller than those two types of bottles? That is where an innovation I believe came around in the mid-century comes in. And let me tell you right now, it's kind of cool, and I think you're going to get caught off guard by it. Alright, now I have a little bit of a confusing bottle for you. What did this and this have in common? Now, think about it for a couple seconds. Think about things you use to make what would go in this all the time. Having trouble guessing? Well, trust me, once you know what this little bottle is, it'll all make sense. This little milk bottle down here, which by the way is a dairy delivery bottle, oftentimes these are pyroglazed with ink for different little dairies, is a single coffee creamer bottle. That's right, the ancestor to those plastic little coffee creamer containers are these little milk bottles right here. Now, me and my friends love these because we can buy a ton of them for not that much money, and it's just really cool to have these tiny little bottles around that were used for creamers back in the day. But yeah, you take this, you dump it into your coffee, you take off the little paper seal, and then you'd send that back to your milk delivery company. And that was how they did coffee creamers back in the day. The next bottle is a little bit specialized, and because of the way it's shaped, I wouldn't even consider it a bottle anymore. Now this rather massive opening container right here hails all the way from Cincinnati, Ohio. All the milk bottles we've been dealing with thus far are actually Michigan bottles. So this one's a little interesting. Think about what could possibly go in this. Just think about the dairy products you consume on not a daily, but a monthly or maybe yearly basis, if at all. Having trouble guessing? Well, this right here is actually a cottage cheese jar. That's right, cottage cheese was also delivered by these dairy delivery companies, and of course for things like that you need a pretty big opening because it's cottage cheese. It's like an amalgamation as opposed to a liquid. So you'd use big opening jars like that to get the cottage cheese out of it. And then of course you'd send that back to the delivery company, and then you get more cottage cheese. I've seen these made by Borden's, I've seen these made by Page out of Toledo. I've seen all sorts of cottage cheese jars, but this is the one I own, and it's a rather straight jar, which is interesting because not a lot of them look like this. The next bottle I have isn't really anything special. It's a milk half-pint bottle, but I think you're going to find that this one's pretty cool. So this bottle right here I got from my grandpa and grandma, and I split my time between a lot of different places, and one of those places is Jackson, Michigan. So this bottle was kind of cool because it's by Unipack Dairy of Jackson, Michigan. Now, what you might notice is this is a half-pint bottle right here. But what's confusing is it's got the size of like a pint bottle. It's got the height of a pint bottle. And the reason why is because it tapers down in the center there a little bit. Now, why they did this, I'm not exactly sure, but I think I have a pretty good idea. And it's because, remember how I said you could order almost everything but milk, and it was often the half pint bottles that had that stuff in it? Well, I think this was meant to be held on to for drinking. For example, you could put your hand right there where it says Unipack and all that, and it would be held there well, so you wouldn't have to worry about it slipping out of your hands like, say, a round quart that's in a traditional shape. So this bottle right here probably would have had your chocolate milk, your orange or cherry or grape drink, or whatever other drink that you were just drinking with your hand, or that you were pouring into something inside of it. You would just hold on to it and you'd be able to grip it really well compared to other types of bottles. See, this is kind of cool. These milk bottles come in all different shapes and sizes with all sorts of quirks to them. You'd never really come across one milk bottle that's exactly the same as the other, even in regards to their markings and oftentimes to their company markings. Even companies have different markings on different times of the day. So, milk bottles are just really cool things to collect in general. With all that being said, I figure I'll end it off here. After a healthy dose of information about these bottles, you should be prepared to explain them to somebody else. You should be prepared to explain them to people you're trying to sell them to. And most importantly, you should have a newfound knowledge and joy of the things which you hold in your collection that I know so many others do. With that, I'm going to end it off with a little shot here of one of my favorite bottles, probably even a little bit more so than my Dunn bottle, my Martha Farm bottle from the 1920s, which I do believe is my oldest. And with that, this has been If These Old Beasts Could Talk. Thanks for stopping by, and like, subscribe, and share if you like this, and you want to teach other people about the history that surrounds us. See you around.